The text came through as I slipped on my coat. Call me immediately. 3 words. No greeting, no context, just urgency from my lawyer, Corwin. My heart dropped as I dialed. His voice was clipped, steady, merciless. My parents had filed an emergency conservatorship petition that morning, claiming I was mentally incompetent to run the very company I had built. The necklace I had just fastened felt suddenly heavy. My coat slid to the floor, and the lemon tarts I had bought as a peace offering mocked me from the counter. Only hours earlier, I had convinced myself this dinner invitation meant reconciliation, maybe a fragile truce. Instead, it was an ambush. The desserts I once loved, my mother's small gesture of childhood warmth, had turned into a symbol of how easily nostalgia blinds you. Tonight wasn't about family, it was about survival, and the war for control had already begun. The warning signs had been there long before Corwin's late-night call. They weren't loud or obvious, but small fractures, disguised as family quirks, tolerated because I wanted to believe my parents' love was simply complicated. Looking back, it wasn't complicated, it was calculated. It started with my father's interruptions during board meetings. He would lean forward just as I reached the crux of a presentation and clarify the point, rephrasing my strategy as though it were his own. The room would nod politely, jotting down his words, while mine evaporated into the air. At first, I brushed it off. He was the patriarch. Perhaps it was habit. But when it happened over and over, I began to notice the way colleagues' eyes shifted hesitant, searching for his confirmation instead of mine. My mother's methods were softer but cut deeper. One afternoon, in front of senior staff, she let out a lilting laugh and said, "Elone forgets things lately, but don't we all?" Everyone chuckled, myself included, because what else could I do? I forced a smile while my chest tightened, silently wondering if they believed her. It was such a small comment, so casually delivered, but its weight lingered. Later, when a junior associate offered to clarify my numbers, I realized the joke had already taken root. It wasn't just inside the family estate. Board whispers began to trickle back to me. "Your father mentioned you've been overwhelmed," one director told me kindly. "Maybe it's time to pace yourself." At the time, I chalked it up to stress, even thanked him for his concern. But alone in my office, I replayed those words and felt a chill. Overwhelmed. That wasn't my word. That was theirs. Planted carefully, passed along until it sprouted in other people's mouths. The erosion wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate, like water hollowing out stone. Each offhand remark, each dismissive smile, was part of a longer campaign. I had mistaken gaslighting for generational tension, convinced myself that family dynamics explained everything. In truth, it was a rehearsal for the petition they would one day file against me. At home, the dissonance was sharper. My parents could shift tones effortlessly. At Sunday dinners, my mother would ask if I was taking on too much in the gentlest voice, while my father sipped wine and remarked that leadership demands balance. I used to think they were showing concern. Now I know they were crafting a narrative, carefully weaving threads of doubt to present to others when the time came. Even my colleagues weren't immune. Some began to hesitate before answering me, their eyes flickering to my parents first, as though waiting for a signal. A few tried to soften it with politeness, but the message was clear. My authority was conditional, fragile, subject to the approval of people who had raised me only to tear me down. And I allowed it. That is what still haunts me. I excused the interruptions as old habits, the jokes as clumsy humor, the whispers as misunderstandings, because the alternative that my parents were orchestrating this erosion was too unbearable to face. The bakery box on my counter came back to me then. Lemon tarts, perfect and sugared, once symbols of childhood sweetness. I had clung to them as proof that maybe reconciliation was possible, that under all the tension there was still love. But now I saw them differently. They weren't reminders of care. They were camouflage, sweetness layered over control. By the time Corwin slid the conservatorship petition across his desk, the foundation had already been laid. My parents hadn't blindsided me overnight. They had been patient, careful, steady in their campaign to chip away at my credibility. And every time I laughed it off or looked away, I had unknowingly helped them build their case. What I mistook for family friction was a strategy. What I thought was harmless banter had been the systematic erosion of my identity as a leader. And now, with their signatures on legal documents accusing me of incompetence, the pattern was undeniable. The truth was brutal but liberating. They had been rehearsing this for years. And the moment I recognized that, I knew the fight wasn't just about a company. It was about reclaiming the narrative of who I was. Corwin's office smelled faintly of coffee and old leather when he slid the thick folder across the desk toward me. Its weight felt heavier than any paper should. Inside lay the blueprint of my parents' betrayal. I forced my fingers to open it, my eyes scanning line after line that accused me of incompetence. The language was clinical but unmistakable. Erratic leadership, emotional instability, unsustainable judgment under pressure. Each sentence carried signatures of people I had once trusted, colleagues who had nodded at my presentations, shaken my hand after deals, and now lent their names to the idea that I was unfit. 2 investors had already signaled support for my parents. Their reasoning was simple: stability. They wanted a familiar family name at the helm, someone safe, someone predictable, even if it meant trading vision for appearances. My parents had given them exactly what they craved: a narrative where I was too fragile to lead, and they were stepping in out of duty, not greed. I pressed my hands against the folder, steadying myself, though my pulse raced. This was no longer about whispers at board meetings or offhand jokes in hallways. It was legal, signed, filed. If granted, the petition would freeze my access to company accounts within days. My name, my authority, my legacy, all placed in their custody as though I were a child who couldn't be trusted with her own creation. That night, my apartment felt colder than usual. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the lemon tarts I had bought as a peace offering, the crusts still dusted with sugar. They mocked me now, proof of how willingly I had walked into their trap. Sentiment had blinded me, while strategy hollowed me out. I whispered the words out loud, steady even as my chest tightened. Then, we fight. The next morning, the fight arrived on its own. A hesitant knock at my office door pulled me from a stack of reports I was gathering for Corwin. Rowan Vale, a junior accountant barely out of school, lingered in the doorway. His shoulders were tight, his gaze flicking down the hallway before he stepped in. In his hand was a folded sheet of paper that looked like it burned to hold. "Miss Marcellus," he murmured, voice so low I had to lean forward. "I think you should see this." His fingers trembled as he passed it to me. Then he backed toward the door. "Please don't say it came from me." When I unfolded it, the air left my lungs. An email printed straight from the company server. Subject line: pre-transition support. The message was short but lethal. "Once we assume interim control, bonuses will be distributed accordingly." Signed by my mother. I read it twice, then again, the words slicing deeper each time. This wasn't concern for my well-being or the company's stability. It was bribery, dressed in polite font. A promise of money in exchange for loyalty. Not if they assumed control when. For a long moment, I simply stared at the page, feeling the tremor of Rowan's fear still imprinted on the paper. He could have stayed silent, let the system reward him. Instead, he risked everything to hand me the truth. His courage steadied me in a way I hadn't felt for weeks. I slipped the email into a folder labeled Evidence. It joined the affidavits, the investor alignments, the signatures that sought to erase me. But this page was different. It was proof not of allegations, but of intent. My parents weren't protecting the company. They were buying it. The shift inside me was undeniable. Up until then, I had clung to fragments of disappointment, trying to reconcile betrayal with the possibility of misunderstanding. But this, This was deliberate corruption. They were orchestrating a coup against their own daughter and dressing it up as mercy. That evening, I sat at my desk long after the city lights flickered on. The evidence spread before me no longer looked like paper. It looked like a battlefield. Affidavits were ammunition, emails were shields, and allies, even trembling ones like Rowan, were lifelines. I thought of the courtroom, of the boardroom, of every pair of eyes that had wavered in their faith when my parents planted seeds of doubt. They would see this. They would see not just my resolve, but the receipts, timestamps, signatures, transactions. Numbers don't tremble when questioned. My parents had chosen war, cloaked in the language of concern. I had chosen survival. Now, with this email in my hands, I knew the battlefield had tilted. They weren't the only ones with a strategy anymore. The disappointment was gone. The longing for reconciliation was gone. All that remained was clarity, the kind that cuts sharp and leaves no room for sentiment. They wanted to erase me. Instead, they had sharpened me, and for the first time, I felt ready. The estate smelled faintly of polished wood and old books when I stepped into the study. Firelight painted the walls in amber tones, a scene staged to look warm and familiar. My father sat in his leather chair, his posture deliberate, while my mother's smile rested carefully between kindness and authority. For one heartbeat, it almost looked like family. Then the words came, and the illusion shattered. "Alone," my mother began, her tone softened enough to pass for compassion. "We never wanted this to feel adversarial. You've done incredible things. But everyone has their time. We just want to make this transition graceful for you." Graceful. Transition. Words rehearsed, chosen like fine silver on the table. My father leaned forward, his hands folded neatly as though we were discussing something trivial, the weather, perhaps, or stock prices. "Better to leave before questions are asked," he said. "We can keep this quiet. Let you step down with dignity. Mercy is what this is, daughter. Mercy." That word landed like ice water in my veins. Mercy. The same parents who had cut me off mid-sentence in boardrooms, who had laughed at my expense in front of staff, who had signed their names beneath allegations calling me incompetent. They now wrapped their betrayal in the language of benevolence. I let the silence stretch long enough for them to believe I might accept it. Then I spoke, each word sharp as glass. "You filed a petition behind my back. You told the court I was unfit. That isn't mercy. It's a mask. And I have the receipts." For the first time, the veneer cracked. My mother's smile faltered, just for a moment, and my father's jaw tightened, but they recovered quickly, exchanging the same silent glance I had seen them trade at board meetings when united fronts were required. They wanted to script this moment, too, to make me the fragile daughter lashing out while they remained composed. I refused to give them the stage. I didn't stay to argue. Any further words would only be twisted, repackaged, and presented as proof of my instability. Instead, I stood, heels clicking against the marble floor, each echo louder than the last. Their composure might have been staged, but the sound of my departure was real. I walked out without looking back, the firelight fading behind me. Back in my own office, the silence was different. Not heavy, but focused. I pulled up the company's financial records with a precision I hadn't allowed myself before, my fingers moving across the keyboard like a surgeon wielding a scalpel. And then the numbers began to glow. A payment of 12,000 to a strategic advisory firm no one had heard of. No reports attached, no deliverables filed. Another 8,500 to a consultant abroad, with no evidence of actual work, just vague descriptions and a trail that ended in silence. On paper, they looked like expenses. In reality, they screamed fraud. I sat back, staring at the screen as the truth crystallized. My parents hadn't just attacked me with affidavits and insinuations. They had siphoned money from the company itself, funding their betrayal with stolen capital. What they called mercy was nothing more than a mask to cover theft. The bakery box still sat on my counter, lemon tarts untouched, but they no longer carried the sting of naivete. They were a relic, a reminder of how easily nostalgia could be weaponized. Now I saw them for what they were: camouflage. Sweetness to hide the blade. By midnight, my office no longer resembled a workspace. It had transformed into a bunker. Reports, contracts, and binders lined every surface, each labeled in bold letters: medical evaluations, revenue growth, client retention, financial records. I built my evidence wall the way I had built the company itself, patiently, deliberately, with no shortcuts. I laid out the clean medical reports first, signed by 2 specialists, confirming what I already knew. No impairment, no decline, no justification for conservatorship. Then came 3 years of revenue charts, each curve steady, margins healthy, growth undeniable. Contracts followed, their signatures proof of trust and performance. And finally, at the center, I placed the financial anomalies: 12, 0, 8, 500, transfers stamped with dates and accounts. Not suspicion anymore, not whispers in corridors evidence. Timestamps don't lie. Numbers don't tremble under cross-examination. As I stepped back, surveying the fortress of proof I had built, something shifted inside me. This was no longer about seeking reconciliation or protecting sentiment. It was about war, cold, calculated, and inevitable. My parents had tried to strip me of my credibility, calling it mercy. I had stripped their mercy down to numbers, to fraud, to undeniable facts. The marble echo of my heels in their study had marked the end of one story. The glow of the monitors and the stacks of evidence in my office marked the beginning of another. The battlefield was ready. And this time, it was mine. The courtroom was colder than I expected, the kind of space designed to strip away sentiment and leave only facts. I walked in, dressed in black, steady, every step echoing against the polished floor. Across the aisle, my parents sat like a tableau of dignity. My mother wore cream, her expression carefully painted into maternal calm, while my father projected the air of a dignified patriarch, weighed down by a supposed duty. Their lawyer rose with rehearsed sorrow and began to spin their narrative. "This is not about animosity," he told the judge, gesturing toward them. "This is about concern. My clients are loving parents who have watched their daughter decline with growing alarm. Erratic decision-making, emotional instability, they acted not out of ambition, but necessity." Every word was polished, pity wrapped in professional cadence. But I could feel the room's eyes shift toward me, waiting to see if their fiction carried weight. I kept my hands folded, my gaze steady. Then it was Corwin's turn. He stood slowly, deliberate, and began laying binders across the bench one by one. The first opened to clean medical evaluations, stamped and signed by 2 specialists within the last 18 months. Both declared no cognitive decline, no impairment, no reason to doubt my ability to lead. Corwin's voice was calm but firm. "Your Honor, these are professional reports, not speculation." Another binder landed with a heavier thud. 3 years of revenue growth, margins tracked quarter by quarter, expansion benchmarks documented and verified. Charts told a story numbers never lie about: stability, health, success. The gallery stirred as contracts and commendations were passed forward. And then came the final stack. Corwin's voice sharpened, slicing through the tension. "Here we have documentation of unauthorized payments: 12, 0 to a shell firm, 8, 500 to an overseas consultant. No reports, no deliverables, no trace of actual work. These transfers were approved by the petitioners, disguised as company expenses." The judge flipped through the papers slowly, his silence stretching until the weight in the room pressed against my ribs. Finally, he looked up, his words landing like a gavel before the actual gavel fell. "You accuse your daughter of incompetence while using her company's funds against her." Gasps rippled through the gallery. My mother's hands tightened in her lap, the first crack in her porcelain calm. My father opened his mouth, stammered, then fell silent. Their illusion, so carefully constructed, began to fracture in public. The judge continued, steady and unflinching. The petition is dismissed. Furthermore, given these irregularities, a review of financial misconduct is hereby ordered. The hammer came down, and with it, the months of whispered doubts and gaslighting evaporated. My parents hadn't just lost their petition, they had invited scrutiny that would expose every hidden transfer, every falsified expense. By evening, the board convened in an emergency session. I sat at the head of the table, Corwin beside me, while the members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Their loyalty had once wavered under the soft influence of my parents' reputation, but now they were confronted with facts laid bare. Corwin presented the evidence piece by piece. The loyalty test emails Iris had sent, promising bonuses once they assumed interim control, the shell payments, the consultant invoices with nothing attached. Each document landed on the polished wood like a verdict of its own. When the presentation ended, silence filled the room, broken only by the shuffle of papers. Then came the vote. Swift. Unanimous. Thaddeus and Iris were stripped of every title, every authority. Their names erased from positions they had worn like crowns. For the first time, they had no script, no stage, no shield. My mother leaned forward, her voice trembling just enough to sound almost sincere. "We only wanted what was best." I met her gaze, my voice cold and steady. "You wanted what was yours. I built what was mine." The words settled into the air, final and unmovable. Around the table, the board members looked not at them, but at me. Some nodded slowly, others with visible relief, as if the ground had finally steadied beneath us. In that moment, the shift was complete. The gavel had silenced their accusations. The board had reclaimed its balance, and the legacy they tried to steal had been defended not through sentiment, but through evidence, precision, and resolve. What they called mercy was nothing but a mask. What I carried now was clarity. Monday morning light poured through the glass hallway as I stepped into the boardroom. Not as someone fighting for legitimacy, but as the chair who had earned it. The table was full, the voices quiet, and for the first time no one looked past me to search for another authority. When the meeting ended, I walked toward the corner office that once belonged to my parents. The blinds were drawn, the desk cleared, the shelves stripped bare. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like release. I paused only long enough to take in the silence before turning away. What they tried to own was never theirs. Legacy is not inherited. It is built. And mine was forged through discipline, evidence, and boundaries. I refuse to let anyone cross again. From today forward, betrayal has consequences, family or not. If you've ever faced control disguised as concern or betrayal where support should have been, you know this fight isn't just about money, it's about dignity. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if my story resonated, subscribe to this channel for more true, hard-won victories and lessons on protecting what you build. Your legacy deserves to be yours alone.